It wasn't the scream that shattered the equilibrium of the House of Windsor. It was the silence, that sudden suffocating absence of noise. Think about the anomaly for a second. For 6 relentless years, the narrative machine out of Montecito didn't just spin, it thundered. It was surgical. Interviews timed to eclipse royal tours, docu-series designed to settle scores, memoirs ghost-written with a grudge so sharp it could cut glass. From the ancient stone of London to the glass mansions of California, this was a war waged in headlines. The palace, ancient and slow, stood still. Meghan Markle, armed with cameras and the emotional arsenal of modern grievance, did not. And then, nothing. In a world absolutely saturated with signal, the absence roared. No podcast, no simmering social post, no fresh teaser threatening to topple the monarchy. The Duchess, whose name dominated algorithms, just vanished from the news cycle. No fanfare, no explanation, just a vacuum. You might think they ran out of ammo. You might think they moved on. But across the Atlantic, behind a set of reinforced oak doors in St. James's Palace, the explanation sat quietly atop a rosewood desk. It wasn't a press statement. It wasn't a rebuttal. It was a dossier. Silent, confidential, lethal. And it was in the hands of the one person the Sussex squad never accounted for. Princess Anne. Most observers described the atmosphere in London that week as ice before the storm. They misunderstood the weather. The storm had already landed. It didn't howl. It audited. Subscribe right now, because while the world looks for the next headline, the real story is happening in the metadata, and what's slipping out is making powerful people very nervous. For years, royal watchers asked what Meghan would say next. But now, the whisper passing through Fleet Street and diplomatic circles is different. It asks, almost fearfully, what has Anne found? Behind the gilded veneer of tradition, the Princess Royal emerged as the only figure unshaken by the drama. While others issued statements, Anne read timelines. She watched patterns. She followed money. It wasn't curiosity. It was duty. And in the frigid, controlled quarters of British power, duty is a terrifying force when it chooses to move. The palace's silence wasn't confusion. It was a trap. It wasn't disengagement. It was preparation. While Montecito thundered, St. James's prepared for a controlled demolition. The spark came when Meghan, in her final media appearance before the blackout, alluded darkly to documents that would cause international outrage if released. It was more than bluster. She spoke with the confidence of someone holding the detonator. In London, that comment didn't provoke a PR scramble. It provoked a forensic response. Inside the palace, the investigation had already been underway, quietly, methodically. But this was the moment the operation shifted from passive observation to active containment. Insiders are calling it the Onyx Protocol. Think of it as the royal equivalent of DEFCON 2. Legal advisors were summoned. Digital analysts were pulled from overseas posts. A command team reporting directly to Princess Anne began sifting through every data trail left behind by the Duke and Duchess during their tenure as working royals. And what they found sent a chill through every department of the crown. It started with what wasn't there. Missing travel logs, bypassed security checks, unaccounted meetings from late 2017. The timeline, once dismissed as irrelevant background noise, suddenly crackled with significance. Names of American PR firms appeared in documents months before the engagement announcement. Payment trails, once lost in the noise of celebrity earnings, began to align with media activity that had previously seemed spontaneous. It wasn't an oversight, it was orchestration. From the start, the entry into the royal family had been accompanied by a team that spoke less of tradition and more of optics. And now, years later, those optics were revealing something closer to a hostile acquisition than a fairy tale. Princess Anne, upon reading the third executive summary from the forensic team, didn't slam her hand on the table. She simply marked a passage and said 3 words, "Prepare the enclosure." It's a phrase Anne's inner circle understands. Not a public rebuke, not a scandalous leak, but an institutional response. Quiet, devastating, irreversible. The royal family would not go to war with words. They would strangle the operation in silence. And so began the erasure. Invisible protections once granted to the Sussexes were pulled, travel courtesies vanished, informal security advisories stopped, access to private diplomatic briefings gone, commercial partners sensing a seismic shift in tone, withdrew. Long-standing media allies stopped returning calls. Even the ever-hungry gossip columns of Los Angeles went still. In Montecito, the change was immediate and terrifying. The Duchess, who once stood by her floor-to-ceiling windows rehearsing her next statement of defiance, found herself unable to act. There was no pushback to counter, no insult to play victim to, just silence, unblinking, absolute. Inside the walls of Kensington Palace, Princess Anne signed the final authorization to dispatch what courtiers would only refer to as the Notice of Intent. It wasn't made public. It didn't need to be. Its content, according to sources who have seen the draft, was short: a conditional threat to release the 2018 bullying report, the pre-engagement financial audits, and the travel logs that had now been cross-referenced with undisclosed meetings. The implication was clear: continue the media war, and the truth will no longer remain redacted. This was not a press strategy, this was Cold War diplomacy. But unlike Montecito's strategy of volume and exposure, the Princess Royal opted for a weapon far more potent: silence, calibrated with precision. And it worked. While the world debated tabloid headlines, Princess Anne's team was dissecting a different narrative, one written not in ink, but in metadata. Their investigation shifted focus to a time that had long been dismissed as a blur of romance and royal preparation: the year 2017. This was before wedding dresses, before balcony kisses, when Meghan Markle was still an American actress, quietly navigating her introduction to royal life. On the surface, it was a time of celebration, but buried beneath the glittering facade were discrepancies that now read like early warning sirens. Analysts working under Anne's personal directive discovered that certain standard vetting procedures had either been abbreviated or outright waived. Background checks, security clearance protocols, extended due diligence, normally airtight in the royal household, had been short-circuited. The reason? Concerns about appearing discriminatory. Multiple aides, now retired or sidelined, admitted in confidential memos that they were pressured to ignore red flags in order to fast-track harmony. The deeper the team dug, the more alarming the pattern became. There were gaps in travel history, discrepancies in customs declarations, a series of unlogged meetings with unidentified individuals, many of whom were later found to be connected to US-based public relations and branding firms. These weren't casual interactions. These were structured, strategic meetings involving corporate image consultants and media handlers, months before the palace was even informed of an engagement. Then came the real shock. Financial flows. Forensic auditors traced a string of irregular payments, small enough to avoid attention, but frequent enough to arouse suspicion. Anonymous donors, LLC shell companies, cross-border wire transfers. It formed a puzzle that, when assembled, pointed to an unsettling reality. The royal transition may have been commercially premeditated. The team uncovered contract drafts from media production companies dated late 2017. Drafts that proposed future docuseries concepts based on a young American outsider navigating the British monarchy. These weren't leaked after the exit. These were brainstormed before the wedding. Anne's personal reaction was said to be uncharacteristically emotional. One aide described her as visibly furious when presented with documents showing how media access was being traded behind palace walls in exchange for favorable coverage. The implication was devastating. The Duchess had entered not to join a family, but to build a franchise. That realization reframed everything. The infamous Oprah interview, now seen as a scheduled climax in a long-running script. The Netflix deal, a pre-existing relationship, not an organic opportunity. The complaints about racism and mistreatment, powerful narrative tools, yes, but also effective shields that, when wielded properly, stifled scrutiny and shut down inconvenient questions. Princess Anne was not simply angry, she was activated. The evidence confirmed what she had long suspected but never voiced, that the institution had been infiltrated not by malice but by method. She began issuing confidential memos to senior staff and constitutional lawyers requesting an expedited review of the letters patent of 1917, the same legislative cornerstone that defined royal titles and privileges. The question on the table was no longer rhetorical, it was legal. Could the royal family prove that their internal mechanisms had been exploited under false pretenses? Meanwhile, the tension inside Montecito began to rise. Sources close to the Sussex household describe a palpable shift in mood during this period. Meghan, previously assertive and composed, was now said to be on edge, making frantic calls to advisors, deleting traces of past correspondences. Harry, less involved in logistics, became consumed by what he perceived as a conspiracy of silence from London. But the silence wasn't conspiratorial, it was coordinated. The palace had chosen containment over confrontation. The legal groundwork was being laid, not for immediate retaliation, but for irreversible removal. The question was not if, but how. The investigation had revealed a chilling truth, that the fairy tale had not unraveled due to misunderstandings or media cruelty. It had been constructed to unravel. Each conflict, each leak, each truth bomb had served the dual purpose of weakening the institution while strengthening a separate monetizable brand. It was influence laundering at its most refined. As Anne turned the final pages of the intelligence summary, she asked a single question to the room. If this had been any other institution, if a CEO had uncovered this within their board, what would they have done? The answer was immediate. Terminate the contract, freeze the accounts, seal the exits. The Princess Royal did not nod. She simply reached for her pen. It didn't arrive as an explosion. It arrived as absence. In Montecito, what began as a pause in media activity turned quickly into suffocation. Calls weren't returned. Publicists went silent. PR agencies that once jockeyed to manage Meghan's image began issuing polite disengagements. Sponsorship talks stalled. And most telling of all, financial back channels, the ones kept intentionally vague through brand intermediaries and charitable pass-throughs, started to wither. It wasn't a scandal that silenced Meghan Markle. It was gravity. Across the ocean, Princess Anne's operation had entered phase 2, a strategic throttling designed not to punish, but to isolate. London was not waiting for Meghan to speak. It was waiting for her to realize she was no longer being heard. The Duchess, who once made headlines with every eyebrow arch, suddenly discovered her words were ricocheting into an echo chamber. Major platforms that had once featured her prominently in interviews and profiles now delayed, deferred, or declined. Internally, Anne's team had identified key vulnerability points across the Sussex media network. Choke points where a discreet pause in support would create a domino effect. Meghan's allies felt it first. Editors grew hesitant. A-listers who had once invited her into curated circles began citing scheduling conflicts. Netflix, already embattled with investor criticism, began reconsidering its Sussex pipeline after a redacted dossier landed quietly on an executive's desk, detailing previously undisclosed conflicts between Meghan's documentary content and confidential royal timelines. The message was unmistakable. There would be no further immunity for narratives rooted in distortion. Inside their California estate, the shift in atmosphere was almost tactile. The usual rhythm of movement, brand calls, video planning, political networking, ground to a crawl. What had felt like the beginning of an empire now felt like an unplugged machine. Sources described Meghan's emotional state as anxiously defiant. She clung to the hope that London's silence was temporary, that the palace was merely regrouping, not retaliating. Her solution: escalation. New scripts were drafted. A second memoir outline began circulating internally. The idea was to provoke a response, to drag the monarchy back into a reactive posture where the Sussexes could once again control the framing. But Princess Anne had already accounted for this. Back in London, every drafted escalation was anticipated before it was published. Meghan's trademarks, her production slates, even the travel bookings for her stylists. Anne's team was tracking it all. It wasn't surveillance in the traditional sense, it was administrative surveillance. Meghan had spent years playing a game of optics. Anne had chosen to play a game of infrastructure. And quietly, irrevocably, the scaffolding holding Meghan's public image began to erode. But it wasn't just professional decay that unraveled the narrative. It was Harry. For 6 years, he had served as her unwavering shield. The loyal husband, haunted by ghosts, determined to rewrite the tragedy of 1997. But in this silence, a new story was emerging. One not shouted from rooftops, but whispered from closed-door meetings. Somewhere in London, a parcel had been sent. Unmarked, secure, hand-delivered to an address in California, known only to senior intelligence channels. Inside it were transcripts, emails, unreleased summaries from the 2018 internal palace investigation. Though redacted, the message was unmistakable. We know, and so do you. Harry read them in silence. There was no confrontation, no explosion, but something shifted in the way he moved through their home. The man who once saw Meghan as a savior began to see a shadow. He started checking timestamps, revisiting memories, noticing for the first time that some of the conversations he remembered had been recorded. The trust cracked, not in a scream but in a glance. Friends close to the couple noted that Harry's public loyalty remained intact, but privately the rhythm of his defenses faltered. He spent hours alone in the garden, stared at the ocean without speaking, declined meetings, citing exhaustion, and most tellingly, he stopped insisting they were doing the right thing. Meghan noticed. Her frustration turned inward. She pushed for a new interview strategy, urged their legal team to consider a surprise litigation move in the UK courts, anything to reframe the silence as persecution. But the silence wasn't coming from the palace anymore. It was coming from within their own home. Anne's strategy had crossed the threshold from political to psychological. It was classic Cold War containment. Create a reality so devoid of friction, so absent of narrative fuel that your opponent begins turning on themselves. Back in London, the final preparations were underway. Legal advisors moved forward with legislation drafts. Parliament had not yet been briefed in full, but early conversations were unfolding under the guise of modernization efforts. Titles, inheritance, Councillor of State privileges, all were under review. Anne was not preparing to strike. She was preparing to sever, and she knew that the moment to act would come, not when the Sussexes roared again, but when they went completely, unnervingly quiet. The monarchy had survived wars, abdications, and assassinations. But this was different. It was the quiet kill of misinformation, slowly reversed, not through scandal or spectacle, but through the removal of attention. Meghan built her power on narrative oxygen. Princess Anne had turned off the air. The seeds of the current reckoning did not begin with a scandal. They began with a conversation, a quiet one, held in the drawing room of Balmoral Castle during the summer of 2022. It was one of the Queen's final private audiences, and only two people were present, Her Majesty and her only daughter, Princess Anne. What was said during that hour has never been disclosed in full, but senior courtiers confirm it was the moment the late Queen Elizabeth II entrusted Anne with a burden she could no longer carry herself. The monarch, then frail but lucid, reportedly gestured toward a sealed folder atop her writing desk and said simply, "If it comes to it, use this to protect the crown, not us." That folder, later nicknamed the Sovereign's Envelope by aides, contained preliminary findings from the palace's internal risk assessment on the Sussexes. Not just the well-known bullying complaints or staff resignations, but deeper concerns, patterns of influence, inconsistencies in Meghan's financial disclosures, and gaps in vetting that had been diplomatically smoothed over at the time but flagged again by security advisors. The Queen had seen enough to understand that the crisis was no longer personal, it was existential, and she trusted only one person to act without fear. Back then, there was still hesitation. Charles, newly titled as Prince of Wales, favoured patience. William wanted to focus on public duty and avoid family rupture. Even the Queen herself was reluctant to escalate in her final months. But the toll was visible. Aides recall how the monarch's demeanour would subtly change whenever Sussex-related updates reached her desk. One courtier said it was the only time her expression turned weary, not firm. She did not want to see her family at war, but she also understood that by doing nothing, the monarchy was slowly being devoured. That legacy now drives Anne's relentlessness. In the months following Her Majesty's passing, Anne quietly assembled a shadow legal task force, comprised of constitutional historians, privacy law experts, and security veterans. Their brief was narrow and chilling: prepare for the complete legal severance of the Duke and Duchess of Sussex, but do it in a way that preserves royal credibility, national dignity, and Commonwealth unity. The name of the internal initiative was coded in documents as Crownstone. At its core was a single principle: no engagement, only extraction. And Anne had one critical ally, Princess Catherine. While Catherine's public image remained serene, school visits, garden openings, international goodwill tours behind palace walls, she played a subtle, pivotal role in restoring public confidence. She was the human contrast to the chaos of Montecito. Unshakably kind, emotionally present, and quietly loyal, Every time Meghan pushed a new headline, Catherine countered with visibility, but never vengeance. It was this contrast that Anne used strategically. Insiders say Anne personally coordinated a sequence of carefully calibrated appearances for Catherine in the final quarter of 2025. Not for image repair, but for legacy anchoring. From Catherine's speech at the UN's Peace and Protection Summit to her patronage announcement for child bereavement services, each event was designed to tether the crown to a deeper narrative, service over spectacle. Meanwhile, Meghan's brand stalled as the Sussexes drifted further from media favor and royal access. Their relevance began to erode. Meghan's team proposed increasingly dramatic comebacks, from a solo docuseries to a political listening tour. But each move collided with the same problem. No one at the top was responding. The palace's silence had transformed from a defensive wall into a psychological gauntlet. And this was Anne's genius. She understood that noise needs opposition to stay loud. Remove the friction, and even the most incendiary statements begin to float, weightless and ignored. But behind that calculated stillness, Crownstone had moved to its final phase, parliamentary clearance. A draft memorandum had been prepared and quietly circulated among key House of Commons allies. It outlined in exacting legal terms the justifications for stripping Prince Harry of his place in the line of succession and removing all remaining constitutional privileges. There was no mention of scandal, no insult, just a cold administrative logic, irreconcilable breach of institutional trust. Anne had waited 3 years to open the Queen's envelope. Now, with the monarchy facing a crossroads, she was ready to use it, not as a weapon, but as a scalpel. The moment that changed everything did not take place in a palace chamber or a televised interview. It happened in a simple, unsigned letter hand-delivered by a senior courier to Clarence House. The sender, Prince Edward. Until that point, Edward had been the quiet one, a stabilizing presence, loyal, discreet, always deferring to duty over drama. But in the days following the internal circulation of the Crownstone Memorandum, he did something no one expected. He formally withdrew his support for the Sussexes' constitutional relevance. The letter was brief, just 3 paragraphs, but its contents hit with the force of a gavel. Edward acknowledged his deep sorrow over the family rupture, but affirmed that the integrity of the monarchy must come before personal compassion. He expressed regret that Prince Harry's recent behavior has escalated to a level where institutional trust is no longer sustainable. Most critically, he closed with a single line: "I believe full severance is not only justified, it is overdue." Within hours, the letter had been read by Princess Anne and then passed silently to King Charles. To outside observers, nothing changed. There was no official comment, no sign of disruption. But inside the royal apparatus, the final domino had tipped. The last defender of reconciliation was gone, and the last obstacle to what aides called the Crownstone activation had been removed. This was not revenge, this was procedure. Over the following days, 3 critical steps unfolded. The Privy Council was discreetly notified. While the specifics remained sealed, constitutional advisors confirmed that a significant royal adjustment was being prepared for legal review. Legal staff briefed members of Parliament's Constitutional Affairs Committee, framing the changes not as punishment, but as long-term reforms designed to modernize succession policy in light of international residency and conflicts of interest. The Church of England was informed due to its ceremonial role in affirming councillors of state and royal legitimacy during major state transitions. In Montecito, however, the signs of change were less official, but far more palpable. The Sussexes' media team, once a hive of polished messaging and digital strategy, began to shrink. Contracts were not renewed, podcast production halted, and crucially, the couple's access to diplomatic courtesy arrangements, quietly coordinated through British embassies and consulates, was suddenly and completely rescinded. Flights that once cleared through VIP lanes now required standard immigration checks. Invitations from cultural and philanthropic organizations dwindled, and Meghan's scheduled keynote for an international women's summit was indefinitely postponed following what one insider described as a loss of reputational alignment. And then something changed inside Harry himself. For months, he had lived in a fog of loyalty, shielding Meghan from every critique, interpreting silence as cruelty. But now, the fog was lifting. The letter from his uncle Edward had found its way to him, unofficially, through an old friend. It shattered something. For the first time, Harry saw that the palace's silence was not driven by cruelty, but clarity. He began asking questions about the Onyx Protocol, the Crownstone Memorandum, and what had truly been unearthed in the audits. His queries were met with calm but unflinching responses from former aides. They didn't accuse, they didn't rage, they simply showed him the files, the timelines, the receipts, and slowly, Prince Harry began to realize the war he thought he was fighting for truth was built on half-truths and manipulated grief. He confronted Meghan one evening, asking whether she had known about the 2017 influence contracts, about the staged media leaks, about the unregistered travel tied to image consultants and ghostwriters. Sources say she didn't deny it. She redirected, she wept, she called it survival. She asked him if he was still loyal. But the question was no longer loyalty. It was identity. For the first time, Harry saw himself not as a protector, but as a pawn. A man who had burned his bridges while believing he was building a better world. A man who had turned his back on a 1,000-year institution for a narrative that now collapsed in on itself with every unanswered email, every cancelled appearance, every silent reply. And that realization broke him. He did not announce his departure. He did not file for divorce. But he did something far more devastating in the world of monarchy. He went quiet. No more statements, no more posts, no more defense. He stopped fighting because for the first time he wasn't sure which side he had been fighting for. Back in London, Anne received the update in the form of a sealed intelligence note. Phase 3. Internal fracture confirmed. Subject, Prince Henry. Recommend proceeding to closure. And with that, the final stage of the operation moved forward. There was no coronet removed in front of flashing cameras. No theatrical scene in the House of Lords. No exile carriage pulling away from the palace gates. The final act of Crownstone came precisely as Princess Anne had intended it. Quiet, absolute, and irreversible. It began with a simple update on the official royal website, buried deep within a routine statement about administrative realignment. An innocuous line read, "As of the 1st of March 2026, the roles and designations of the Duke and Duchess of Sussex are concluded in accordance with revised constitutional guidelines." No titles, no Councillor of State appointments, no references to working members of the royal family, just white space where history used to live. And then came the true blow, the one not released to the public, but to Parliament. A cross-party review committee, having received Anne's full Crownstone dossier in confidence, unanimously supported the Royal Succession Clarification Bill, which passed its third reading without debate. The bill did not mention names. It did not need to. It merely established a rule. No person permanently residing outside the United Kingdom and engaged in private commercial activity may occupy a constitutional role or position of sovereign proximity. That single clause erased Prince Harry's position in the line of succession. With no need to strip titles publicly, the monarchy achieved what would have once been seen as impossible: total removal, with no scandal attached. The law was elegant, sterile, and devastating. And now, as the final update is entered into the royal record, only one truth remains. Silence is not the absence of power. Sometimes it is the proof of it. If you understand what just happened, hit subscribe. Because the real history isn't written in headlines. It's written in the things they make disappear.